Hello and welcome to this special panel discussion that I have today with a couple of experts in the insurance field that can really help us as accounting professionals when it comes to cyber threats and looking at the insurance angle of it. Because as much as we have so much to really learn, most of us, because cybersecurity is a huge topic, I'm not hearing much about cyber insurance or what we can do if all of a sudden something happens, or stories about what has happened to others when it comes to a cyber attack. Because obviously the best is to try to prevent it, but then we also need a backup plan in case our preventive measures don't totally work. So we have this couple experts, as I mentioned, and so we're going to jump in and ask a few questions. But first, let me mention our objectives today are to consider why is it important for us as bookkeepers and accountants to look at cyber insurance. And this is not a commercial for that. This is truly an informative session about cyber insurance and what can happen, why we might need it. Also, the options that are available to you, because it's a fast-changing field, because cyber threats are growing very quickly as the technology is moving very fast. So it's constantly changing. So it's to find out what we do have available to us. And then some real lessons learned from the trenches, like what's really been happening. And David is going to share some of that with us. And of course, if Jock has some as well. And of course, I've referred to them, but let's meet our panelists. We have Jock Wall with us. And Jock, I'd rather hear it in your own words. Who are you and why should we listen to you?
Yeah, I'm a specialist insurance broker, focus on professionals and professional service firms, and my expertise really resides on the professional liability policies and cyber liability policies. And so that's, hopefully I can opine on that in our panel discussion today.
Okay, excellent. And then we also have David with us. David, I should have asked you, your last name is Trevey, is that correct?
Trevey, long E.
Okay, very good, very good. And so, same question for you. Who are you and why should we listen to you?
Gabrielle, thanks for having me. I'm an attorney in Lexington, Kentucky. For the past 15 years, I've been doing professional liability defense of all types, including accountants, CPAs, and bookkeepers. And as of recently, or the last couple of years, that has stretched over into cyber liability for professionals and the interface between cyber liability and professional E&O liability in Kentucky.
Excellent. And thank you both for coming. I really appreciate this because we don't typically have access to experts like you to really give us insight into this area. So I appreciate your time very much in helping us with this. So just a quick disclaimer, as much as David is an attorney, I'm not. And this is really just an informational session to help you get insight and start the wheels turning and thinking about how can you protect yourself and what to do if a threat happens. But cybersecurity is really a huge topic. So we're really just focusing in on how it affects us as accounting professionals. And when you're ready to make a decision, you really should contact your own expert, professional, lawyer, insurance, accountant, IT professional, when they know your specific situation, because of course we cannot know your specific needs. And then, just to get us on the same page here regarding cybersecurity and cyber threats, what they're all about, we're using the definition from Cisco, and it's really the second part of this that we're focusing in on here, is these attacks are usually aimed at accessing, changing, or destroying sensitive information, extorting money from users, or interrupting normal business processes. And Jock and David, would you agree with this definition from Cisco?
Yeah,
I would, but I don't. The aspect of it that strikes me as somewhat interesting is that they might want to interrupt normal business process. I haven't seen much of that. I've seen a lot of the extorting money and trying to get the sensitive information, but we don't see so much work from hacktivists or people that just want to mess up the situation. It's usually people that are after money or information that can get them money.
Interesting, because I was just reading about there's certain ransomware that I guess isn't really designed to, I'm trying to remember the name. It wasn't WannaCry, but there's another one that it affected a lot, but it really didn't make how much money. It was an article about how much money they've all made, which was interesting. And then in my own case, fortunately, it was just a basic WordPress website. I had a defacement hack, and it didn't affect anything. There was no problem other than they were just kind of like, see, I did it because I could. So, but it makes sense that we wouldn't necessarily see that in your situation because there really wasn't any loss there.
I think it also depends on the industry that you're sort of focusing on. The threats are so broad that you can't really just pigeonhole a cyber threat into one particular industry or one particular threat. And the objectives of the bad actors varies, whether it's to steal information, whether it's to extort you for money, whether it's to gain access to funds through fraudulent instructions. It really just depends. And so I think professional service firms, professionals, they tend to be at greater risk of from the ransomware, extortion, wire transfer fraud element, rather than the loss of information or a hack that steals social security numbers and credit cards, or credit card information. And the latter is really what is generating most of the publicity, just because of the scale of those attacks and the scale of those losses, whether it's Capital One or Marriott, and the list keeps on growing week or month after month. So it's and that adds to the complexity of this whole topic.
Yes, it does. Well, so I mean, it's constantly changing and growing and expanding. So let's talk about cyber threats from each of you. How do insurance companies view the risks of cyber attack for the accounting profession? And I'll go to you, Jock, first on that.
Yeah, and I would just add to your list of disclaimers that the discussion that we're having today is going to be very insurance centric. So as the audience learns from our talking points today, keep in mind that the general awareness and the education should still come first and foremost. Insurance is really a tool designed to help arm you as part of your risk management processes and procedures that you can utilize if called on. And so, as you mentioned earlier, this is the angle that we're kind of taking on today's panel discussion.
Yes.
Like I mentioned, just after you pulled up the Cisco definition, the risks for or the cyber threats that impact the accounting profession, bookkeepers, accountants, they tend to mainly stem, or the losses mainly stem from the ransomware or wire transfer fraud type of incidents. Doesn't mean a loss of information or a hack where they steal sensitive information can't occur. It does. Part of the challenge is that, especially in the small business world, the companies don't have the same kind of IT infrastructure that when the latter occurs, when the hack occurs and information is lost, they may not even. So when the ransomware or when a first-party loss occurs, it's right there. It prevents them from running their business. It prevents them from the money is gone from the account. So that's where the majority of the claims activity is, and it tends to also be more of a severity type of loss. But as companies kind of underwrite towards that risk, and as they tailor their coverages, that is where the main concern stems from insurance companies. So if you kind of tie it in with an insurance policy, the policies vary greatly, just in terms of the evolution of the actual cyber threats in the landscape. That it's not a very standardized product yet, and most of the insurers, they will, when it comes to social engineering fraud, ransomware, they either exclude those coverages or they sublimit them and try to limit their exposure. So that's also a sign of, okay, that's where they see most of the activity. That's what they're kind of concerned about, especially for the accounting profession.
Interesting. So we have to take a careful look at the policies too, then.
Yeah, and it's difficult, and David can probably provide better insight than I can from a legal perspective. But including things like the definitions of the policy, or what certain threats are called, whether it's ransomware or extortion or social engineering fraud versus cyber crime or wire transfer, those type of definitions change from one policy to the next. So
Interesting.
It increases the difficulty of really comparing what you're buying and what you're not getting.
So David, what have you seen from your perspective? Because you're on the defense side of it. Have you seen how the insurance companies have maybe shifted some of what they're seeing as risks in our profession?
A little bit. I want to touch upon something that Jock said. He said that most of the indemnity payouts are related to ransomware or those types of things, wire transfer fraud. I think he said that. And I wondered how defense costs and the cost to get your hands around the claim have impacted that, because that's what I see most is if there's no payout, you've got to get your team together. You've got to get an IT investigator who may or may not be your IT professional. You've got to engage an attorney to advise you on your potential liability and what you have to do with various attorney generals if you have information for people in far-flung states, not just your own locality. You've got to get your hands around whether you have notification duties to those clients, and then oftentimes the insurance companies have preferred vendors who they want the attorney and the insured professional to use to do those notifications in a manner that manage to get all of the clients, and they charge a per piece fee. So I was curious as to whether or not with these cyber liability policies, there's a sublimit on insurance or costs or cost to defend the claim or get their hands around the investigation of the claim, attorney's fees, and whether or not those are becoming more apparent, because it seems to me even if there's no actual loss, we must spend a great deal of money to figure out that there's no loss and get our hands around exactly what happened.
From the defense element, or the I guess the traditional cyber coverage, which I would classify as network security and privacy liability, the third party element and the defense costs associated with that, or mitigating or rectifying a claim, those I haven't really seen. I think that's become accepted in terms of, hey, this is what the coverage is intended to provide. So there's less of a restriction on those type of coverages. It's the more frequent or the more recent type of threats that have evolved. And I'm thinking of social engineering fraud, a phishing scam, where a policy 5-6 years ago probably didn't intend or contemplate that type of threat. And since then, the policy had to be tailored and the coverage had to be amended to either include it or exclude it and sublimate it. So, but the actual defense element, I think that's I haven't really seen much of many restrictions or limitations around that. So that's good news for you, David.
So I guess a key thought from this is what you mentioned, Jock, is that basically the insurance companies have to keep shifting with what's
Correct.
happening with the threats being changing, then they have to look into it to see what's changing and what can we cover, what don't we cover. A quick question on what they exclude. Do they exclude things because it's too much of a risk? What causes them to say, no, we won't cover that?
I think there's the primary reason is probably the coverage has evolved over time. They didn't originally contemplate it. So, and I'll just pick on social engineering fraud in the definition of terms and the coverages. They will say we will cover network security and privacy liability. We will cover the third-party element. We will cover maybe rectification or data restoration costs. We will cover IT vendor services, et cetera, et cetera. That social engineering type of fraud, it wasn't an issue or a big issue back in the day. So a policy just hasn't evolved to cover those type of threats.
Interesting,
Now,
because to me
so
that
that
seems like a hole. It
yeah,
seems like a whole.
it is a whole. So there's a leg.
Servers and hardware on our location. Now most things are in the cloud.
Exactly. So think about how technology has advanced over recently and how quickly everything's kind of moved to the cloud. So there's an element of a legacy issue with actual insurance policies, but then there's also the other part is there's a deliberate decision not to cover or to sublimate those type of exposures or threats because that is where most of the activity is. That is where they've seen some of the claims. So, but in general terms, I would say the market, the coverage, the newer policies and newer products that are coming to the marketplace, they have to evolve and they have to adapt and they have to be offered. So at the end of the day, if a broker kind of recommends, hey, you should buy this policy and it's got a sublimit of 250 grand or this social engineering fraud is excluded versus here's another option where there is coverage, there's potential liability on the brokers or the agent side that they recommended a policy that had insufficient coverage in place. So there's that part too where the older and redundant, the obsolete policies just they're going to lose traction.
Thank you. That is fantastic because it means that the devil's in the details as usual, although we're detailed professionals, but we shouldn't just think, oh, I've had that coverage for years, it's fine. We have to be reviewing it and making sure that we have the coverage we need, or we may have a gaping hole in the changes of the threats. So very good. Thank you. That was very helpful. So let's take a look at that. What are some of the options that we have? I know before you had spoken to me, because you, Jock, you work a lot with small solo professionals as well.
Yep.
And what is the path that many of us follow, maybe from startup to, a mid-market firm?
Yeah, I would say most small businesses, solo professionals, they will probably be more familiar with professional liability insurance rather than cyber liability insurance. As we're talking about, cyber is more of a recent product. The take-up rate continues to increase, partly driven by the publicity surrounding the big events. But if you as a part-time bookkeeper or solo accounting professional are looking at your insurance options, either you don't buy professional liability or cyber liability. It's likely that you probably have a professional liability policy in place ahead of purchasing a cyber liability policy. And I would say at the very least start there. The professional liability, as David will explain soon, there's overlap with the cyber threat. What some insurers are doing is that they offer an endorsement onto the professional liability policy, which means they're extending the coverage to cover some cyber threats. And again, it doesn't mean it's very basic coverage. It's got overall kind of concerns about cyber threats and you want that wire transfer fraud coverage or you want that social engineering fraud coverage. It's not going to cover that. But it at least provides some form of coverage. So if you lose information or there's a data breach, then most cases there is a basic form of coverage for that. And then as you kind of move along, the cyber liability policy, a standard or a bespoke type of product with those coverage enhancements is sort of the next step. So you're basically going from don't buy professional liability with a basic endorsement to cyber liability.
Very good. And David, what thoughts do you have on this, like the crossover, or any other thoughts?
Well, what I think is interesting is the people that have come to me that have an endorsement on their errors and omissions professional liability policy. They're often surprised how quickly we can blow through that amount of coverage that endorsement is.
Yeah, that's true.
Sometimes as little as $25,000, $25,000, which sounds great when you're getting the policy and this is an endorsement and it's a freebie and we'll toss it in. And then you realize that $25,000 may not cover the outside IT investigation to figure out how you got hacked or how you got phished, what information was breached, or was there rectification of that, notification of your clients, let alone bringing in an attorney to advise you or another accounting professional that experience to advise you. So you can blow through a $25,000 endorsement that's a tackle on pretty quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in that case, if there's insufficient coverage, then what happens? Is it that the business owner just has to pay for it out of their pocket? Because it's still certain things like notifying those who may have been affected. You're required by law to do that, right?
You are in many instances. Various states, some a little more ahead of others, say that you have to notify the clients, and not only that, you have to notify the state attorney general in a lot of occasions, and give them the okay. We know we were ransomware, we were hacked. Here's what we're doing. Here's the changes that we've made, so that the state attorney generals can be assured that you are not a continued risk.
Yes, that's good to know. And a quick question that comes to mind, because I have in mind some recent ones in the accounting profession that have been in the news the past couple of weeks. Is there any law or ramifications, I guess, I don't know if that's the right word, for when they are aware that there's been an attack to the time that then they notify those whose information was exposed?
Meaning, is there a 90-day, you must notify all of your clients within 90 days, or that kind of provision?
Yeah, that kind of a thing. Because I'm some of these we hear, oh yeah, it happened back in March, and you're like, hello, why are we just hearing about it now? So.
Well, in my experience, some of the difficulty is even when you bring in the outside IT professional or even use your in-house IT professional, these hacks are very well put together, and it's hard to ferret out exactly how the hack happened and determine exactly what kind of data and information was exposed, if any. Sometimes ransomware doesn't intend to expose your data, it just intends to lock it up so that it's inaccessible to you, but it doesn't necessarily get out there and go onto the dark or anything like that. So the answer to your question is it's probably a state-specific question. 50 states, 50 different sets of laws, and no overarching federal government regulations in that area that tell the states what they have to have. But some of the reason for that delay that you're seeing in the larger hacks and even the smaller hacks is probably, in my opinion, due to the length of time it takes to figure out exactly what happened, exactly what was exposed, get the legal advice of what do you have to do with that information.
That makes total sense. Thank you. That's helpful. All right, so moving on. When a claim does arise, what happens when it's discovered? We've kind of talking a little bit about that, but let's hear a little bit more, like what happens when ransomware is the obvious one, because then all of a sudden, I mean, the software itself tells you that you've been attacked. But is there a specific protocol, I guess, that happens pretty much in every case, David? Or Jock,
Well,
I mean, either one of you, but let David go first.
I assume we're talking after you've kicked the plug out of the wall.
Yeah, exactly. When you're like,
Heard that it's ongoing. I got to stop that from happening or doing anything else. Especially in the course of ransomware, before it's even finished, you might see some changes on your files. If you're trying to access files through some sort of program, you may see that some of your files are the names have changed, and then you might catch it in the act before it's completed all of its locking everything up. But obviously getting off the network, turning the machine, turning the server off, turning all the possible points of entry off is the first step. The second step is better get on the horn to your IT provider and hope that you paid for the 24/7, 365 response from your IT group so that they can get their hands around it. From there, it seems like notification to your insurance company to invoke the coverage, and then getting your team in place to try and advise you, investigate, and tell you what you have to do with that information. And a lot of people are surprised that it takes, because that process is so lengthy, getting back to work, being able to turn those machines on and start your work again. I had a situation where this happened to a tax preparation client towards the end of March with an April 15 deadline, and a couple of days down, as any tax professional will tell you, during that time is a really bad time to be out of business and unable to process anything.
yeah, wow, that sounds like a major nightmare at that point, even if there's coverage, just because of the timing. Jock, what about with smaller, like solo professionals who maybe aren't working off of a server, they're just cloud-based, they might even be working from home or working from a very small office, or even have contract workers? When something like this happens, what's the general path that they have to follow?
It's very difficult, because as in practically almost all of the smaller firms or sole practitioners, they won't have a written incident response protocols. They just, you don't think about it. You don't even know where to start putting something together. You can look online and try to craft something, but it's really not
online with a different computer.
with a different, yeah. I mean, it's just not the preparation piece is just not. It's just very difficult to kind of put something together. So if you think about the three steps of risk management, where you've got your risk assessment, your preparation, and then the response. It's the first two. Okay, you can do so many things. The response is for cyber threats. It's really critical, because, as you mentioned, and David said, during tax time you're down for a couple of days. I mean, it's just unfathomable almost. So the response element for having an insurance policy in place, that's where the real value kind of comes out, because you can, worst case, you don't have an IT provider that you've worked with. Right. You don't even know where to start. You call the carrier and say, hey, I've got a claim, I've got an issue. Help guide me through this. Yes. And they will take a very proactive approach to it. So,
go ahead, David.
Jock, one of the things that I've noticed is that, and I only see stuff after it's happened, right? I've not called in for risk management most of the time, but that most of the carriers that write this type of insurance do have a stockpile of risk management stuff to help you with.
They do.
And protocols that you can put in place, and the planning. They're very happy to help you on the risk management front end, and provide you a lot of substantive material. So I thought I'd toss that in.
Yeah, no, you absolutely right. So when you think about cyber threats, and this is where the education also comes in, it's you have to look at this. Okay, what's the risk? What are the threats you're trying to manage, mitigate, contain? And And it's not just I'm going to buy an insurance policy and I'll be done with it, because there's other elements of these threats that you need to manage, and the risk management. So the carriers, they understand that, and they try to use a better risk. Should generate a better portfolio, right? So on average, they want to promote it. Where I have and it's great for medium to large organizations which have resource dedicated to that, to those initiatives. For a part-time or a solo bookkeeper, they may think about it, but how practical is it to take a template and converting it for their own purposes? So but you're right, Dave. I mean, the general awareness and just kind of thinking about it and working through it and demonstrating that an aptitude towards risk management, that's the very first step, and that's why I kind of say general awareness, education. Start with that. I'm not saying don't buy an insurance policy, but you really need to think about it as in a consolidated kind of manner.
Yep, Jock, I'm going to put you on the spot. Would you be up for you and I working together to come up with just like a real basic little cheat sheet of here's the steps you should have in place, like your plan, if something happens and you're a solo or small practice where it's basically you up to a virtual team? What are the things we need to do? Would you be up for that?
Just could be pretty simple. Just a one-pager, insert insurance company's telephone number. So,
yeah.
But yes, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean that again, from my perspective, it just we got to recognize who the audience is and just kind of keep it simple and practical. So I'm committed to that.
Okay, and then do either or both of you, have a best practice that our viewers can walk away with in this case about like what happens when there's an attack? David?
I agree completely with Jock. Have that phone number for the claims department of your carrier right at hand. If you're not covered, you need to have a plan in place for who you would have help you deal with the situation. Maybe that's your IT consultant, if you have one of those. Maybe it's an attorney that is specialized in understanding cyber liability threats or professional liability threats. Maybe it's another CPA that has gone through the same situation before.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, I agree with David.
An emergency phone number list, and you can put it in your phone. So if it happens on a computer and also written down paper somewhere.
Yeah, I agree with David. I mean, after the audience or after someone watches this, spend 15 minutes just Googling who's my local IT consultant in cybersecurity. You don't have to reach out to them, but just think about it. And who's a local attorney who's an expert in this field? Who can I call if something happens?
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, because as they say, forewarned is forearmed, and all those things that say, an ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. So we're trying to do the prevention here. So let's hear a few of the stories. I expect that David will have some, and Jock, you may as well, but I want to start with David because he probably has the juicy ones. What are some of the things you've seen?
Some of the ones tie into cyber liability. Some of them sort of stand alone, but you can see how a cyber liability aspect may play in. I defended an accounting professional that was doing, I won't call it freelance bookkeeping, but it was contract work for a small business, a small family business that didn't have a lot of controls, and had an on-site called keeper. They called her an auditor or they used auditor incorrectly. They used the CFO. She changed her title a lot. At any rate, she was embezzling, and they went after. the contract bookkeeper for not seeing the embezzlement in doing the bookkeeping and financial statements, and not comparing cost of employee overtime or where the money was going from the petty cash or that kind of thing. And before they knew it, it was $90,000 worth of loss or so before they could even figure out how it was taken over the course of 2 years. Now, the liability of the contract bookkeeper obviously had the letters, the contract and engagement letters. I'm not looking for this kind of stuff. You give me data, I'm putting bad data in your books. That's just the way it is. But she was doing those kind of things remotely, and was logging in to the bank accounts of the small business, and had the needed, every time they changed a bank account or added a new bank account, they would just email her the login and password unprotected. That's a peeve of yours. But not only that, one of the accountants here, we do tax preparation in this firm, told me that when she's trying to get into someone's bank account, they often have the third-party questions or the security questions if it's an unfamiliar computer, and they're such that she can kind of guess at it. What was your high school mascot? And they can go to Facebook and figure it out very quickly. Yeah. Oh, it was, and so it's the Trojan, and turns out the answer's right. So putting all that information out there is some of the things that really make me, get upset and bite my tongue.
Yeah, before we started recording, I was sharing some war stories with David on things that happen even today, with one of my clients finally actually following protocol to keep sensitive information secure, which is a first for that particular client. So that was good. What about you, Jock? Any specific claims you can think of for accounting professionals where they were either protected or when things didn't go so well?
I mean, David pretty much nailed it on the head. The classic one is the phishing kind of scam, and you got to recognize that phishing it's not an event that happens at a particular moment. It happens over time. So the partners email and they start collecting information about you, where they then they're in your system, and the bad actor pulls the trigger, and they send instructions to the other party to hey, send the money to this bank account. We're ready for this whatever it is, real estate transaction, or the CFO someone needs something happen over relatively quickly, and the time frame is relatively short, and then by the time the professional or the firm uncovers that event, it's too late. So yeah, that's to me, that's the phishing scams are scary in the sense that they're watching you. The bad actors are watching you, and they're monitoring you, and they're impersonating you very effectively.
Yes,
and I've seen one recently where they were in and monitoring on an email, waiting for a good transaction.
That's right.
That they could in the last minute change of wiring instructions, which is something that ought to be really near and dear to the heart of freelance bookkeepers that are paying these vendor bills and paying these transactions as directed. And oh, by the way, last minute change.
Yeah,
money's gone.
And that's what I was. It happens over time, and you're being watched. Big brothers or big bad guys watching you, and then they time it really well, and then they go in for the kill.
Yes,
they're very patient, which is scary.
Yes, and I've had experience. It was we caught it, so it wasn't an issue. but had an experience where basically one of my clients got hacked, and it was phishing, and they were watching the emails, saw that I was her bookkeeper and that I paid her bills, and they were trying to get me to pay something, and it was like, this doesn't seem right. They didn't watch long enough. I guess they weren't patient enough, because it was pretty quick to recognize that something's not right here. So it was all, nothing happened bad. But David, a question for you, having seen these, is it definitely sounds like, and from where I sit, the workflow of the bookkeeper or the accountant, they need the internal controls, the checks and balances. A clear example is very specifically with the paying of the bills, because Jock, you had that example where money was paid because they thought they were being told by the client, is that your workflow needs to include documented approvals as well, using something like bill.com, or I personally use Pluto, which it's built in that nothing can be paid until you have the documented approval from the client. So if the bookkeeper is using the bank's bill pay system, which does not have any of that control in there, do you see that, David, that it's a lot of times the loss could have been much lessened or even prevented had the bookkeeper or accountant had better internal controls and workflow?
Oh, absolutely. But I find it's usually not your audience that's the problem. It's usually training the client to abide by the system, and as you said, try and get them not to send the information unsecurely. But all of the systems of the professional bookkeeper, the freelance bookkeeper, are for naught if they can't make the clients do that. And I'll tell you, it doesn't matter, from my experience, how bad the client was in their side of things. When they lose the money, they're going to point the finger straight at the professional that they thought was protecting their back.
Yep. Irrationally so. Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you both. That's much appreciated. So, the last couple questions is, over the years, what lessons have you learned that you could pass on, and what's one best action that our readers and listeners and viewers could follow?
I'll first. Okay, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I like David. Go.
Age before beauty, so go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much.
You can tell they're friends.
I think the lesson that I've learned and I'm trying to impart is, people see this out there, but small and solo practitioners somehow think that because they're so small, they're not a target. And I think that's probably the lesson that I want to reach out the most is, you may be more of a target because of your lack of IT infrastructure. Educating yourself on the fact that there is a threat, the nomenclature, all these definitions, all these things that we've talked about, they're not things that I knew anything about 4 or 5, 6 years ago. And I think the smaller professionals need to take it seriously, learn about it, and then the best action that I think they can take to recommend is to involve themselves in the process of how do I look at my own system and do something about this? How do I look at my workflow and do something about this? I think if they start down that path, one, pretty easy to get made afraid of at this point in time, pretty easy to get educated, and then the steps that they may need to take to protect themselves. If they're thinking about that, they're probably a good way towards getting something done in this arena for themselves.
Excellent. And Jock?
Yeah, very, very similar thoughts. That the solo professional, you're not insulated from cyber threats. You are as much at risk of suffering a cybersecurity incident as a large organization. And you just have to understand that cyber threats, there's just not one single cyber threat. They are very broad, and each one may target a different segment. The big ticket item, the millions of records of credit card information or social security numbers. That's one piece. The ransomware, they don't really care if you're a large organization or a small organization. In fact, it's getting $1,000 it's just that shotgun approach where they try to lock down the bad actor locks down your system. Give me $1,000 in Bitcoin, and I'll move on. And out of the hundreds of thousands of email addresses that they send, and they try to penetrate and get you to open the malware, it's a couple of bytes. So on an aggregated basis, it adds up. And the individuals with the lower security standards and the lesser awareness are the ones that are under threat. As I mentioned before, after watching and listening, spend 15-20 minutes just doing some basic research of like, hey, who's a local IT vendor who I can call, and who's an expert in this field in the event something does happen. I'm not saying you need to draw up a huge incident security response protocol, but just think about it. It's that general kind of awareness and understanding of, hey, these threats are real. I'm preparing by doing these things, and in the event something happens, I've at least thought about it previously.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you both very much. Much appreciated. So I will say thank you, and I will ask each of you. So if any of our readers have additional questions or they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way they can do that? Jock?
Phone 859-327-5594, or email address Jock, Jock, .Wols, WOLS, at myriskdesk.com.
Very good. And we'll include that with this video post as well. And what about you, David?
Same phone number, 859-296-2300, or find us on the web at Kinkead and Stilz in Google. It's ksattorneys.com, and our profiles are on there.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you both very much. Very much appreciate you taking your time today. You're both busy professionals yourself, so it's been a huge help. And together, I think we're going to help mitigate some of the risks that accountants and bookkeepers are facing. So thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. It's been good.
Okay. And turn off the recording.
All right.